My stepmother, Catherine, regarded the reading of my father's will as the biggest success of her life. She didn't realize it was her final error. The fire crackles and spits embers onto the stone hearth. It is the sole sound in the cabin, the only thing moving in the oppressive silence of the big cypress swamp. Outside, the world is a gloomy, suffocating wall of ancient trees and unknown creatures that slither in the shadows. Inside, it's just me, the fire, and the stack of papers on the rough-hewn wooden table. This is my heritage, not the paper itself, but the truth that lies within its aged strands. The reality feels colder than the January air seeping through the window frames. 6 months ago, I would not have understood this type of cold. My world was Miami. It was the humid, salty air, the blazing sun on the turquoise lake, and the persistent, low hum of prosperity. Our South Beach villa was more of a showpiece than a home, a fortress of glass and white marble that stared fiercely out to the Atlantic. But within that stronghold, I had created a small sanctuary in my mother's orchard garden. One afternoon, the sun warmed my back and the air was full with the lovely, delicate aroma of phalaenopsis blooms. My soil-stained fingers gently misted the petals of a Lillian's Pride hybrid, which my mother had grown herself. Each plant was a memory, a living reminder of a love that had been gone for a decade yet still felt more genuine than anything else in the house. Your mother would be so proud of how you care for them, Leo. My father's voice seemed weaker than usual. I looked up. Arthur Vance ruled boardrooms and had his name inscribed on buildings, yet in the garden, the weight of his empire seemed to melt away. His visage, often a mask of savvy negotiating, was fatigued. The creases around his eyes were deeper than I'd remembered. He put a strong hand on my shoulder. She always said you had a gentle soul, he added, his gaze buried in the bright colors of the orchids. I managed a faint smile. It's the only place in this house where I still feel her. This was the truth. After my mother died, my father remarried Catherine, and the warmth in our home was gradually replaced by her cold, calculating style. Family portraits were replaced with abstract art. Comfortable furniture was replaced with items that looked like they belonged in a museum, aesthetically pleasing but impossible to relax on. I know things haven't been easy, he continued, his voice halting in his throat. With Catherine and... I'm fine, Dad, I replied, cutting him off before he could finish. I did not want him to feel guilty. As long as I have you, I'm okay. We stood there for a minute in comfortable stillness, a rare moment of connection in a house that had devolved into a battleground of unspoken conflicts. I believed he loved me. It was the only foundation I could rely on the shifting sands of my family life. But I could see the unseen weight on his shoulders, Catherine's shadow over him, and I knew deep down that our serene moment was temporary. That vulnerability was destroyed every evening at the dinner table. The dining room served as Catherine's throne room. An outrageously long block of polished mahogany sat beneath a chandelier dripping crystals like frozen tears. Catherine always sat at the head of the table, like a queen surveying her dominion. She was a lady chiseled from ambition and Botox, always clothed in luxury labels that screamed out their prices. Brendan and Chloe, my step-siblings, sat opposite me. Brendan resembled a Wall Street villain from an 80s film, complete with slicked back hair, fancy clothing, and a permanent scowl. Chloe was his vacuous equivalent, her existence appearing to be based on the reinforcement she received from her phone screen, her conversations consisting of hashtags and celebrity gossip. That night, the tension was strong enough to be cut with one of the absurdly ornate silver knives. "Leo, darling," Catherine began, her voice dripping with an artificial sweetness that might cause a toothache. "Have you given any more thought to finding a real job? Managing that little library. It's just not very Vance, is it?" I felt a familiar heat rising in my neck. I enjoyed my job. The quiet seclusion of the historical archives, the scent of ancient books, and the idea of preserving stories were in stark contrast to the loud, shallow world she lived in. Brendan gave a short, piercing laugh. "Oh, let him have his little passion, Mother. Not everyone is born to run an empire." I gripped my fork beneath the table, my knuckles becoming white. My first reaction was to strike out, defend my decisions, and point out that his sole job was to spend our father's money on bottle service and terrible investments. But I did not. Instead, I looked to my father. He appeared tired, caught in the crossfire as usual. "Leo's work is valuable," Arthur stated, his voice steady but fatigued. We need more people who appreciate knowledge. Catherine gave him a look. It was a fleeting glimpse, but it was packed with frightening intensity. A subtle, poisonous instruction that made my father, a titan of industry, shudder in his own home. In that instant, I realized the reality with painful clarity. I was an outsider, a remnant of a past existence that my father had been compelled to compartmentalize. I trusted his affection because I had to, but I also realized that, in the cold fight for dominance of the Vance family, I was hopelessly and completely alone. I just didn't anticipate how rapidly the war would escalate. The call came on Tuesday, a cardiac attack, sudden, huge, and final. My father was a complex individual who I adored, yet he was suddenly gone. The days that followed were a jumble of condolences from strangers and chillingly efficient arrangements made by Catherine, who wear her anguish like a fine accessory. The day of the will reading felt like the concluding act of a play I had no desire to participate in. We sat in the antiseptic, mahogany-paneled office of a lawyer who appeared to have been born wearing a three-piece suit. The air was thick with the aroma of old paper and greed. Catherine, clad in mourning black that did nothing conceal her triumphant flush, sat perfectly poised. Brendan and Chloe were standing close to her, scarcely suppressing their smug expectation. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat and began reading in a dry, repetitive tone that belied the words life-changing force. He droned on about legal corporations and holding companies, using terminology intended to hide the naked transfer of power. My heart pounded against my ribs, a frenetic drumming in the quiet room. And therefore, my entire controlling interest in Vance properties, the South Beach penthouse, the yacht the Catherine, and all liquid assets I bequeathed to my beloved wife, Catherine Vance, I saw it. Catherine's lips curled into a smile, which she swiftly stifled. It was a small, almost undetectable sound, but it was as loud to me as a gunshot. 2 trust funds, each valued at $50 million, shall be established for my children, Brendan and Chloe Vance. Brendan straightened his tie, a delighted smirk creeping over his lips. Chloe looked up from her phone for the first time, her eyes bright with ludicrous excitement. They exchanged a secret, delighted look. My hands started to sweat. I waited with my breath gripped tight in my chest. There had to be something. Trust in me, stocks, property, something to prove that I mattered. Finally, Mr. Abernathy added, adjusting his glasses, to my son, Leo Vance, whom I have always loved, I bequeath the family cabin in the Big Cypress Preserve and all its contents. The words hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. The hush that ensued was deafening. The cabin. A dusty, forgotten relic from my father's childhood, worth less than the vehicles in their garage. When compared to an empire, it was an insult. A public humiliation. It was a slap in the face given from the hereafter. Catherine eventually broke the silence, her voice a symphony of fake sympathy. Oh, Leo, your father must have wanted you to have a quiet place to reflect. Brendan couldn't keep it in any longer. A snort of laughter sprang from his lips. The sound slashed through me, sharper than any knife. The brutality, the cold, premeditated disdain in this time of deepest loss was unacceptable. This wasn't only about money. They had taken my father from me, and now they were attempting to remove his love for me. I walked out of that office, dazed. The intense Miami sun felt like an assault. The city's sounds, traffic, talk, and distant music, were a jumbled noise that made no sense. It was as if the world had shifted on its axis, and I was sliding off. It wasn't just the loss of inheritance. It was the harsh, public confirmation of everything I had feared for years. I meant nothing to them. My father's affection, the only thing I had held on to, now felt like a lie. Had he actually seen me as insignificant? Was our connection, those calm moments in the orchard garden, just a product of my imagination? I sank onto a bench, the city horizon obscured by a coating of tears I refused to shed. The shock was a bodily sensation, a cold weight in my gut. The anguish I felt for my father had become hopelessly entwined with a new, piercing pain, the ache of complete betrayal. I had lost my father twice, once to death, and again to the cold, hard words of his last will and testament. However, hope is a persistent weed. In the days that followed, a desperate plan began to emerge in the haze of my misery. Perhaps there was an error. Perhaps Catherine used undue influence or manipulated him in his closing days. I gathered together what was left of my finances and located another lawyer, a lady with friendly eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. whose office was in a modest building far from downtown's dazzling towers. I told the narrative, my voice quivering with fury and anguish. She listened calmly, nodding and reviewing the copy of the will I had brought. When I finished, she sat back in her chair, her face stern. "I'm very sorry for your loss, Mr. Vance," she remarked, her generosity making the situation worse. "But I have to be honest with you. This will is ironclad." She tapped a text in the document. It was drafted by one of the best firms in the state. "Your father signed it of sound mind and body, according to the attached physician's statement. Catherine was present, yes, but so were two independent witnesses, a partner from the law firm and your father's longtime accountant. Both respected men." She looked at me straight, her sweet eyes suddenly filled with professional pity, making my stomach turn. "To challenge this, you'd need to prove coercion or diminished capacity. Against these kinds of resources, it would be a long, brutal, and very public fight. A fight that would drain every penny you have, and in all likelihood you would still lose. The system, it's locked up tight." I'm sorry. I left her office with all of my hopes dashed. The door to justice had not only been closed, but also bolted, barred, and sealed shut. The world did not value good and wrong. It was a place where only power, money, and well-crafted legal documents were considered important. The sense of helplessness was total. But as I strolled through the darkening streets, my powerlessness began to subside. It twisted and hardened inside me, burning away my anguish and misery and leaving something else in its wake. A cold, harsh, incendiary wrath. If the law could not provide me with justice, I would have to construct my own. The drive to the Big Cypress was an adventure into another planet. The noon and pastel artifice of Miami faded away, leaving behind the limitless, flat expanse of the Everglades. The roadway extended out like a dark ribbon, a cutting through a primitive environment of sawgrass and murky water. The sun had set by the time I turned into the dirt road that led to the cottage, illuminating the sky in vivid orange and purple hues. The cottage looked exactly as I remembered it from childhood visits, a basic, solid structure of dark cypress wood, partially swallowed by the approaching wilderness. Unlocking the door let forth a flood of stale, musty air. Dust motes danced in the last rays of sunshine that filtered through the dirty windows. It was a ghostly location haunted by my father's past. During the first few days, I did nothing. I walked between the two little rooms, my steps echoing in the solitude. I was floating in a sea of misery, and the wrath that had brought me here was now a dull, throbbing agony. I was a monarch without a realm, a son without a father, and a man without hope. One night, driven by a cheap bottle of whiskey I discovered in a dusty cupboard, my restraint finally cracked. A deep, guttural scream escaped from my throat, a sound of utter misery swallowed by the unconcerned marsh. I lashed out, my fist making contact with the wood-paneled wall. Pain surged up my arm, acute and electric. But something else occurred. The panel I had hit gave way, groaning as it slid inward. Curiosity broke through my intoxicated stupor. I pried the unfastened panel with my fingertips. It wasn't simply a panel, it was a cleverly concealed door, with the seams hidden by the wood's natural grain. It swung open with silent hinges, revealing a small, hidden compartment. It was a small, neatly organized office, in sharp contrast to the remainder of the dilapidated cabin. A single desk, a chair, and a file cabinet. On the desk was a big steel lockbox and a solitary, thick envelope bearing my name, Leo, written in my father's familiar, definite script. My hands trembled as I picked up the envelope. The letter within was multiple pages lengthy. I started reading. "My dear son," the letter started. "If you're reading this, that means I failed. I failed to shield you from Catherine, and my last, desperate attempt to give you a fresh start has been put into action." My breath got locked in my throat. I continued reading, my eyes consuming the words. He wrote about Catherine and how he had realized her true nature years before. How she drained the company's resources with her lavish spending, and how she exploited others around her. Then came the first shocker. "I've known the truth for many years, Leo. I hired a private investigator. I couldn't get over the feeling that something was wrong. I was correct. Brendan and Clue, they are not my children. Catherine had an affair early in our marriage. The guy is long gone, but the children remain. I've kept this a secret to avoid a controversy that would have destroyed the firm, which I've worked my entire life to establish for you." I needed to sit down. The floor underneath me felt shaky. Brendan and Chloe. frauds, illegitimate successors to a throne they had no claim to. My father had been living with this deception for decades, like a poison he ingested every day to protect his empire, to protect me. The pain I felt was quickly replaced with a rush of angry, clarifying wrath. My father was not a fool who had been duped. He was a prisoner inside his own home. With shaky hands, I discovered the lockbox key attached to the back of the desk. I opened it. It was not stocked with cash or stock certificates. It was an arsenal. Stacks of documents. The private investigator's reports included fuzzy images of Catherine with another man, financial statements for undeclared offshore bank accounts under her name. In addition, there are 2 approved laboratory reports. Paternity testing. The scientific and undeniable evidence of her treason. My father had told me the truth. He had handed me a weapon. The grief did not evaporate, but rather evolved. It solidified into a single, frigid point of intent. I scattered the documents across the cabin floor, exposing the damning evidence of Catherine's life of deception beneath the dim light of a solitary lamp. The grief that had been weighing on my mind for weeks vanished, leaving behind the keen, exciting clarity of a predator who has just caught the scent of its prey. I was no longer a victim. I was the hunter. The transformation was not instantaneous. It was a gradual, deliberate loss of my former ego. The peaceful, scholarly librarian was buried, and something new, harsher and more cruel, began to grow from the chrysalis of my rage. The first several days were spent in a frenzy of eating. I studied every document my father had left me repeatedly until I had memorized account numbers, dates, and names. I underlined crucial portions, drew lines connecting shell firms to offshore accounts, and plotted the flow of funds Catherine had plundered over the years. My father's secret office became my war room. I drove to the neighboring town and sold my little car, the final remnant of my previous existence. The money seemed solid and real in my hands. I used money to purchase a new, powerful laptop, untraceable burner phones, and encrypted hard drives. I spent hours in the local library, which is now a place of research rather than refuge, looking over volumes on international finance, money laundering, and digital security. I learned about cryptocurrency tumblers, virtual private networks, and legal loopholes in Cayman Islands banking. I had previously admired the world of knowledge for its beauty, but now I exploited it for its tactical use. My appearance started to change. I stopped shaving, revealing a dark, unusual beard on my jaw. My face developed new, sharp angles as a result of a lack of sleep. My eyes lost their delicate melancholy and became intensely focused. When I looked in the mirror, I could barely recognize the man staring back at me. He appeared dangerous. He appeared prepared. My plan began to take shape, not as a single, bright concept, but as a steady, deliberate building of pieces from the rubble of my previous life. A straightforward exposes was out of the question. Going to the press with paternity results would be messy and public. It would provide me with a sense of moral victory, but it would also tarnish my father's and my own reputation. Catherine would derive perverse satisfaction from a dramatic public downfall. No, it was too easy for her. It was not enough. She stole a fortune from me. My justice would be pecuniary. She humiliated me and made me feel weak. My retaliation would be to make her feel the same way, taking away her power $1 at a time. She prioritized money and social prestige over all else. This was her vulnerability. That is where I would strike. I would not be Leo Vance, the disinherited son. I would be a ghost. An unidentified, scary whisper in her ear. A blackmailer who knew her deepest secret. I would force her to spend the money she had taken to buy my silence. I would bleed her dry, transfer by transfer, until the entire bequest she had taken was sitting in my own encrypted, untraceable account. It was a horrible strategy. It was a pernicious strategy. I believed it was a type of poetry. I pinned Catherine's photo to the center of a large corkboard that I had purchased. I pinned photos of Brendan and Chloe, bank statement printouts, and asset maps all around it. My opponent has been quantified and displayed. My mission was obvious. I wasn't just taking my money back, I was reclaiming my life, piece by agonizing piece, from the woman who had attempted to steal it. The initial move in a chess game is always the most important. It establishes the tone for all that follows. My initial move has to be flawless, undetectable, and terrifying. I drove for 2 hours to a busy strip mall in another county. I entered a public library. The irony was not lost on me, and sat at a computer station in the back. My appearance had changed now. A cheap baseball cap pulled down, non-prescription glasses, and a thrift store jacket. I was nobody. My fingers hovered above the keyboard. I had already created a number of encrypted email accounts that were routed through servers in 3 different countries. The message was already drafted and saved on a coded flash drive. It was simple, brutal, effective. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding against my ribcage. This was it, the point of no return. I launched the email client, attached the single, carefully chosen file, and put in the recipient's address. Catherine's private personal email address, which I had learned from my father's notes. As I was ready to push send, I noticed a movement outside the library window. A comfortable, haughty swagger. Brendan. He was heading out of a high-end electronics store a few doors down, with a shopping bag. My blood became chilly. He was here. What if he entered the library? What if he recognizes me? My hand froze on the mouse. For a brief moment, a rush of panic threatened to engulf me. This was reckless. This was ridiculous. But then I noticed the smile on his face as he got into his brand new sports car, which my father had paid for. The panic subsided, replaced by a burst of ice-cold determination. I pressed send. Then, with careful precision, I deleted the computer's temporary files, logged out, and removed my flash drive. I walked smoothly out of the library, disappearing into the nameless afternoon crowd, my pulse gradually slowing. The first stone has been cast. The chase was on. Back in the cabin, I viewed the world through the luminous screen of my laptop. I had placed spyware, a gift from my father's sophisticated security measures on the family network, which provided me with access to their daily lives. I noticed Catherine open the email. The subject line was unassuming, a South Beach secret. The body of the email contained simply one imaging, a photograph. It was one of the private investigators' photographs, blurry but unmistakable. Catherine, years younger, having an intimate kiss with a man who was undoubtedly not my father. I had carefully edited it, displaying just enough to be damning but not enough to indicate the full extent of my knowledge. A single line of text appears below the image. A 500,000. Account information from Cayman National Bank will be sent shortly. You have 48 hours. This is only the beginning. I couldn't see her face through my remote access, but I did notice her cursor trembling. I observed her create a new internet tab and frantically type the name of a reputation management agency before deleting it. I watched her access her internet banking portal. The hook was set. She was afraid, and she was prepared to pay. The next 48 hours were the longest of my life. I scarcely slept, relying on black coffee and the nervous energy coursing through my veins. I watched as she frantically transferred money between accounts, a computerized ballad of despair. Then it occurred. A notification. A wire transfer from a Miami bank to an unnamed account in the Cayman Islands. $500,000. The first droplet in what would eventually become a flood. I felt a flush of triumph so strong that it almost made me sick. It works. She saw the ghost I'd manufactured as genuine. A few weeks later, I sent my second email. This time, it contained a short, badly distorted audio clip, a fragment of a phone call between her and her lover that was recorded by the investigator. The quality was terrible, but her voice and the word Arthur, pronounced with casual disdain, were audible. The demand was strong, to 1 million. This time the transfer took longer. I could see the tension. I discovered that she needed to liquidate a stock portfolio after reviewing financial data. This move did not go unnoticed. Brendan's email to Catherine flashed up. Mother, why the sell-off during a depressed market? Our advisor is concerned. Her remark was cold and contemptuous. This is a strategic relocation. Do not question my handling of your father's estate. The first cracks began to appear. The money she was using to pay me was supposed to be saved for her children. Her secret compelled her to betray them, just as she had deceived my father. The third demand was a masterstroke. I provided a severely censored copy of one of the paternity tests. The majority of the information was obscured, but the important phrases, probability of paternity, followed by a damning 0% remained visible, along with Brendan's name. The demand is $5 million. This was a hit she couldn't take from liquid assets. Days later, I saw the advertisement go up on lining a luxurious holiday condo in Aspen, which she and her children adored, was for sale at a fire sale price. The fallout was immediate. Chloe sent a slew of angry text messages. You are selling Aspen. WTF? Where should we go for New Year's? This is societal suicide. Catherine's paranoia, which I could detect through her increasingly erratic web searches. How to find a blackmailer, private investigators for cybercrime, and symptoms of a nervous breakdown was reaching a fever pitch. She became a prisoner in her own glass house, plagued by an unseen attacker. The financial burden began to erode her relationships with her children, which were built on a foundation of shared greed. They witnessed a mother squandering their inheritance. They had no idea she was desperately trying to protect them from the truth, which would render their fortune meaningless. Month after month, the cycle repeated. A blurry photograph, a bank statement, a tidbit of information. Each one was a surgical hit on her sanity and net worth. I took everything. The revenues from art sales, the funds from depleted investment accounts, the money she was supposed to live off for the rest of her life. I saw as the Vance empire, which was so strong and powerful, was hollowed out from within, leaving only a weak, empty shell. Finally, when my offshore account was worth nearly the same as my father's whole fortune, I realized it was time for the final act. I sent one final email. I told her it was over. All she had to do was deliver the final cash payment from the sale of her most valuable asset, her jewelry, to a precise place. In exchange, I would turn over all of the original evidence, everything that could ever expose her. She was desperate. She was broken. She consented quickly. I chose an abandoned warehouse in the industrial sector, a site of rust and decay away from South Beach's manicured lawns. It was an appropriate setting for the end of her world. The night of the gathering was cold and wet. A solitary naked bulb projected lengthy, twisted shadows around the huge area. I stood in the dark, waiting. As her car pulled up, I heard the crunch of gravel and the timid click of heels on the concrete floor. She was carrying a big briefcase. A figure emerged from the darkness, walking into the little circle of light. That was me. Catherine gazed, her eyes widening in surprise before narrowing in pure contempt. She let forth a dry, raspy laugh. Leo. She snarled the name in insult. You. Don't tell me this was all. You. I took a step forward, my expression emotionless. The boy she had discarded and belittled was gone. The man standing in front of her was a stranger, formed in the embers of her wrath. You always did underestimate me, Catherine, I said, my voice bland and devoid of the intensity that had once possessed me. That was your second mistake. Your first was thinking my father was a fool. I held up one file folder. Not the originals, those were safely stored, but copies. He knew, I replied, allowing the words to hang in the silence. He knew everything, about your lover, about Brendan and Chloe. He knew they didn't carry a drop of Vance blood. The arrogant mask she wore did not simply shatter, it crumbled. Her carefully constructed world, her entire identity, disintegrated in that one moment. Her face lost its color, replaced by a terrible gray pallor. It was no longer a dread of being exposed. It was the horrible, retroactive awareness that her entire life, her great achievement, had been based on a lie she thought she was alone in telling. Why? She began, the word scarcely audible. Why didn't he? For honor, I said, the word tasting weird on my tongue. For the family name. Things you would never understand. But I'm not my father. I don't care about honor. I care about justice. Every dollar you've transferred to me over the past year. That was my inheritance. You just delivered it personally, down to the last cent. The briefcase dropped from her grasp, striking the concrete with a dull thud. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the ground, a broken and forlorn image in the faint light. She'd lost everything. Money, power, and the lie she'd based her life on. And the peaceful, sweet guy she had dismissed without hesitation was the architect of her demise. I glanced down at her, the woman who had brought me such anguish. I expected to experience a surge of triumphant gratification, a cathartic release. But there was nothing. Only a big, hollow void. I'd won. The conflict was over. But now that everything was over, I didn't know who I was meant to be. A few months have passed. I kept track of them, a leftover habit from my time as a ghost. The ultimate act of their family tragedy unfolded exactly as I had envisaged. I noticed a picture online that was secretly taken by another customer, Catherine, appearing haggard and 20 years older, eating alone in a crummy cafe. Brendan and Chloe arrived not for a reunion, but to have her sign the final legal documents, which involved selling the Miami villa to pay off the tremendous debts they had all accumulated. Their expressions were devoid of pity, Simply icy, sullen contempt for the mother who had somehow lost their riches. She was completely alone, devastated not by my revelation, but by the shallow, transactional nature of the family she had built. Her fate was a cage of her own creation. I returned to the cabin, where everything had begun and concluded. The millions of riches resided in a maze of digital accounts, safe and untouchable, yet they gave me no consolation. My all-consuming need for revenge suddenly felt empty. It hadn't cured the wound, it had only cauterized it, leaving a hard, unfeeling scar. I had become as cold and deliberate as the lady I intended to destroy. The cabin was just how I had left it. My father's letter remained on the desk in the secret office where I had dropped it. In my wrath and despair, I had only absorbed the first section, which provided me with my weapon. Now, in the suffocating silence, I picked it up again and read it all the way through, even the last few paragraphs I had skipped over. I have one last truth to tell you, Leo. The most significant one. You're not my biological son. The words appeared to leap off the page, altering all I thought I knew. You are the son of my dearest friend David, who was more like a brother to me than anybody else. He and his wife perished in a vehicle accident when you were just a year old, and I promised them something. I adopted you, loved you as if you were my own child, and have never regretted it. Leo, you're the best part of my existence. This cabin is where David and I grew up, where we spent the summer. This was not a punishment. It was a form of protection. I intended to provide you an escape from the toxicity of my life, a location that was truly yours, and a new beginning, distant from the deception of the Vance name. The money was not the inheritance, son. My love for you is the actual heritage. I slid onto the chair, holding the letter with shaky hands. My carefully crafted universe shifted on its axis once more. I looked about the dusty hut, at the stone hearth, the rough-hewn walls, and the vista of the ancient cypresses. It was not a representation of my disinheritance. It served as a sanctuary, a last desperate deed of a father's love. He had given up his own peace to defend a youngster who was not even his blood relative. The thick shell I'd erected around my heart eventually broke. For the first time since his death, I wept. Not cries of rage or betrayal, but tears of profound, heartbreaking understanding. I had avenged a guy who, while not my biological father, had chosen to be my father in every manner that mattered. I restored a fortune, but in my pursuit of vengeance, I nearly lost sight of the one true inheritance. As dawn arose and the marsh was painted in gentle shades of gray and rose, I stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool and pure. I hurled the file I had assembled on Catherine. The images, the bank statements, the entire sordid history of my revenge, into the fading embers of the previous night's fire pit. The papers curled, darkened, and then burst into flame, the story of my wrath reduced to ash and smoke before drifting away into the dawn sky. They say that revenge is best served cold. However, sometimes it simply freezes your own spirit. My father had offered me an escape, a fresh start, and I had plunged back into the midst of the fire. I had received his money back. But only now, standing in the silent embrace of his actual legacy, could I finally start the long process of rediscovering myself.